The sea spits secrets onto the rocks of Cornwall. Most are mundane, a tangle of kelp, a broken spar, the bleached bones of a gull. But on the night of the Amaryllis wreck, the sea delivered a secret that would become a burden of iron and a bond of blood for Elias Thorne, keeper of the Longstone Light. It was November 1867, the kind of night when the very air tasted of salt and impending doom, and the wind howled a tune Elias knew too well, the siren song of the grave. Inside the squat granite tower of the Longstone, 60 feet above the boiling waves, Elias tended the magnificent lens, a prism of brass and glass that threw a comforting yet futile beam against the gale. His life was a routine of clockwork and oil, a solitary existence that had long ago sanded the edges off his own memories. Then, the crack. It wasn't the groan of the tower in the wind, but a sharp, splintering sound, swallowed quickly by the storm's roar, yet unmistakable. A ship had met the teeth of the reefs. Elias, a man carved from the same hard granite as his tower, didn't hesitate. He secured the lamp, grabbed his thick oilskins and lantern, and descended the spiral stairs 3 at a time. The stone steps were worn smooth by years of his boots and the boots of the keepers before him. Outside, the world was a maelstrom of white spray and black shadow. The churning water was an ink-dark thing intent on destruction. Following the faint, dreadful sounds of snapping timber and desperate cries, Elias scrambled down the treacherous path toward the lowest tide line. The Amaryllis was a merchant brig, now a coffin of wood and rope, breaking apart against the notorious Serpent's Fangs, a cluster of submerged rocks. The scene was pure chaos, lit only by the frantic dance of his lantern and the sudden terrible flashes of lightning. He saw bodies, dark and still, being dragged back by the undertow. He worked with a grim efficiency born of training and habit, pulling 2 sailors, unconscious but breathing, onto a sliver of sheltered beach. They were heavy, soaked things, one missing a boot, the other bleeding profusely from the head. He couldn't carry them both back to the tower. They would have to wait while he searched for more. It was then he saw her. Not clinging to wreckage, not floating like the others, but somehow wedged in a small, miraculous alcove of rock, sheltered momentarily from the worst of the waves. She was small, draped in fine, dark cloth that the water had plastered to her form. Not a sailor, a passenger, a woman. He reached her, his breath ragged. She was unconscious, her face unnaturally pale against the blackness of her soaking hair. He felt for a pulse, a flicker of life, and found it, a thread of defiance against the storm. As he began to lift her, his lantern beam caught a glimpse of something strange. A leather satchel strapped tightly to her chest, not waterlogged, but made of treated heavy hide, and on her wrist a glint, not a cheap trinket, but a wide cuff of wrought gold, inlaid with symbols that didn't look British, symbols that seemed to writhe in the weak light. He didn't know why, but a sudden icy premonition gripped him. This was not a routine rescue. This woman and whatever she carried were not meant to be found by the usual authorities. An instinct, sharp and urgent, drove him. He dragged the woman further back, tucking her deeper into the alcove, and covered her with a piece of canvas salvaged from the wreckage. He then ran back to the 2 sailors. "Hold fast, lads!" he roared into the wind, knowing they couldn't hear him. He was a keeper of the light, bound by duty to report all survivors, all deceased. But the cuff, the bag, the feeling in his gut, It all conspired to create a moment of profound, treasonous decision. He made his choice. He left the two sailors, knowing they had a fighting chance where they were. He scrambled back to the woman, shouldered her slight weight, and began the brutal climb to the tower. He was not just carrying a survivor, he was smuggling a secret into his isolated world. Chapter 1: The Uninvited Guest. Elias managed to haul the woman up the last few feet of the outer stairs and through the heavy, iron-bound door. He slammed it shut, sealing out the tempest. The silence inside was thick, broken only by his ragged breathing and the wind's muffled shriek against the thick walls. The long stone light was his sanctuary, a world of his own making, 3 miles off the Cornish coast. It was a place of solitude, logic, and order, everything the world outside was not. Now that order was shattered, lying on his workroom floor, a woman dripping seawater onto his meticulously scrubbed pine. He laid her on his narrow cot near the small iron stove. She was small-boned, but not frail, and as he carefully cut away her sodden clothes, he saw that she was young, perhaps no more than 22. Her skin, even pale from the near drowning, had a subtle olive tone that spoke of distant, warmer lands. He noticed immediately that her clothes, though ruined by the sea, were of exceptional quality, a deep indigo wool, and beneath, the strange, heavy satchel was still strapped to her chest. He didn't unbuckle it. He simply tucked it beneath the pillow, covering it with a blanket, his heart pounding a dull rhythm against his ribs. After wrapping her in dry wool blankets and placing hot stones at her feet, he checked on the 2 sailors he'd left. They were gone. The tide had turned, the small alcove swallowed by the rising angry sea. A cold wave of guilt washed over him, but it was quickly replaced by a fierce resolve. He had one survivor now, and he had to protect the woman he had saved. From what, he wasn't sure. From whom, he feared to guess. He went to the lantern room. The great lamp spun and shone, oblivious to the drama below. He ran his hand over the polished brass. He would report the wreck, report the 2 deceased sailors he had found too late, and report no other survivors. The world was far away. Who would question a lighthouse keeper, battered by the storm, miles out at sea? He went back down, his mind already spinning the lie, reinforcing the iron wall around his secret. The woman stirred an hour later, just as the first gray fingers of dawn began to touch the eastern sky. Her eyes fluttered open, a startling, clear amber color he'd never seen before. She didn't scream or thrash. She looked around the small circular room with an intelligence that immediately demanded his respect and caution. Where am I?" she whispered, her voice husky and accented, the R's rolling slightly. It was not a familiar accent. "You are safe," Elias said simply, his voice rough from disuse. "The long stone light. I am the keeper, Elias Thorne." She tried to sit up, but a wave of nausea forced her back down. "The ship, the Amaryllis." "Lost," Elias confirmed, his gaze steady. "There were other men. I couldn't save them. Only you." She closed her eyes, a single tear escaping the corner and tracing a path down her temple. She was mourning, but there was a fierce, practical alertness about her too. "The satchel," she murmured, a single word that was an instant command. Elias retrieved it from beneath the pillow. It was heavy, and the leather was stiff. He handed it to her. She clutched it, holding it to her chest like a shield, her amber eyes flicking to the door, then the small circular window. She was calculating her position, her vulnerability. "What is your name?" Elias asked, gently. She hesitated. A long moment stretched between them, filled with the wind's persistent moan. It was a moment of decision for her, a choice between truth and fabrication. "My name is Layla," she said finally, "and I cannot be found here. No one must know I survived. No one." Her plea was delivered with such conviction, such quiet desperation, that it solidified Elias's earlier decision. He found himself nodding, a man already ensnared in a conspiracy of silence. "Why?" he asked, though he knew the answer might compromise the isolation he craved. Layla took a ragged breath and looked him dead in the eye, her grip on the satchel tightening until her knuckles were white. "Because, Mr. Thorne, the people who sank that ship weren't trying to steal cargo." She paused, letting the truth settle between the granite walls. "They were trying to steal me." The granite chamber of the lighthouse became a cell, both for Elias and his guest. The storm raged for 2 more days, a protective, deafening shroud that kept the mainland and its inquiries at bay. Elias was a man accustomed to the predictable solitude of the sea, but now the presence of Layla, silent and watchful, was a volatile charge in his orderly world. She was recovering with unnerving speed. By the 3rd day she was moving stiffly, observing his routine. Elias, in turn, observed her. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes constantly sought the horizon, and the unwavering possession of the leather satchel. She never let it out of her sight, even sleeping with it clutched in her arms. It was morning when she finally spoke of it again. Elias was cleaning the lamp mechanism, the great polished clockwork that ensured the light's steady rotation. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice soft but with an edge of steel, "I need to know the risks. When does the supply boat come?" "Every Tuesday, weather permitting. 2 days from now. And yes, they'll ask about the wreck. The bodies of the sailors will have washed ashore further down the coast by now." "You told them there were no other survivors," she stated, not as a question, but a fact. Elias stopped working and finally turned, meeting her amber gaze. "I told them what they needed to hear. Now you tell me, what is in that bag that has people trying to murder you?" Layla took a slow, deliberate breath. She unfastened the heavy bronze buckle of the satchel and carefully placed it on the small wooden table. The leather was thick, clearly designed to withstand the elements and intrusion. "This is not gold or jewels, Mr. Thorne," she said, her accent lending a musical authority to her words. "It is information, specifically ledger books." She opened the satchel just enough for Elias to glimpse the contents. Stacked neatly inside were 3 small, hard-bound volumes, their covers a nondescript dull green. "These books," she continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "detailed the flow of a private investment consortium, not simply money, but influence. They track who in the highest ranks of Whitehall, who in the East India Company, and who among certain powerful American banking families are being paid, and for what purpose." Elias frowned. "Blackmail? Extortion?" "Far greater than that," Layla said, closing the bag quickly, as if the air itself might read the contents. "It details the funding and logistical support for illegal operations in the colonies, specifically the manipulation of commodity prices, the bribery of naval officers, and the smuggling of weapons into the Ottoman Empire to destabilize the region for profit. It implicates British ministers, a German shipping magnate, and several New York financiers who profit from the resulting chaos."
Elias felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He was a keeper of a lamp, not a player in global shadow games. And you had possession of these? Why? Because my father was a bookkeeper for one of the consortium's lesser partners, a man in Istanbul. When my father realized the true scope, he transcribed these ledgers meticulously, forensically, and arranged for me to deliver them to a specific person in London who has the integrity and the power to expose them all. The moment the partners realized my father was missing, they knew what he took. The sinking of the Amaryllis was not an accident. It was a clean, brutal attempt to ensure these books never made landfall. The silence that followed was immense. Elias was holding not a secret, but a fuse. His lighthouse, his safe haven, was now the temporary repository of an international scandal that could topple governments and ruin dynasties.
The Tuesday supply run arrived under a weak, watery sun. The boat was the Gannet, a sturdy cutter piloted by Thomas Cribbs, a fisherman whose weathered face held the accumulated suspicion of 50 years on the Cornish coast. With Thomas was Mr. Alastair Finch, the official representative of the Trinity House Board, the authority overseeing all British lighthouses. Elias stood on the small landing stage, the cold spray already soaking his trousers. He felt the weight of Layla's secret pressing down on him, forcing him to stand taller, his face harder than usual. Finch was a meticulously dressed man, even in the rolling boat, wearing a dark suit that seemed absurdly dry. He stepped onto the rocks with surprising agility. "Thorn, a grim affair, the Amaryllis," Finch said, offering a gloved hand. "The bodies were identified. Poor souls. We need to confirm your log. Your official report stated you found 2 and that they were deceased when you reached them, correct? No sign of a woman, a passenger?" Elias looked Finch straight in the eye, delivering his lie with the precision of a master artisan. "No, sir. The storm was ferocious. I reached the reef as the tide turned. There were 2 men, snagged on the rocks. No pulse. I searched the immediate area, only debris, no other bodies or signs of survivors. I spent the next hour securing the lamp and the tower against the gale. A woman, you say. Perhaps she was dragged under immediately." Finch pulled out a small notebook. "Yes, a Miss Layla Al-Khoury, traveling from Istanbul, we understand. A peculiar passenger list, that. Now, about your tower." The inspection of the tower was his reprieve. Elias moved through the mechanical checks with rote competence, explaining the oil reserves, the clockwork, and the condition of the lens. Finch, satisfied, took his measurements and scribbled in his book. As they were preparing to leave, Cribbs, the fisherman, scratched his chin, his eyes narrowed, looking towards the tower's small upper window. "Funny thing, Elias," Cribbs mumbled, not looking at Finch. "Your light's been burning brighter than usual, hasn't it? Thought I saw a different shade in the glass, a flicker near the lantern room, where there's usually none." It was a probing, casual comment, a test of the keeper's nerves. Cribbs, a local man, understood the minute details of the Longstone light better than any official. Elias met the fisherman's gaze, his own eyes as clear and cold as the sea. "It's the new lens polish, Thomas. Trinity House sends it. Makes the beam sharper. Must be the angle you saw it from. And the oil pressure's been high. Good conditions despite the wind." Finch, impatient, clapped Cribbs on the shoulder. "The lighthouse keeper knows his lamp, Cribbs. Get the supplies unloaded." The exchange was brief, but the warning was clear. The mainland was observant. The lie had been uttered, but the slightest deviation from Elias's solitary routine would be noticed and questioned. As the Gannet pulled away, cutting a white foam trail across the blue, Elias looked up at the window of his living quarter. He knew Layla was watching. He had survived the First Inquisition, but he also knew that Alistair Finch would be filing his report, and somewhere powerful people would be reading it, waiting to see if any survivor was mentioned. Layla's satchel was a time bomb, and the Longstone light was the chamber where it ticked. Elias's life of peaceful isolation was over. He was now an accessory to a secret that reached across continents. As the small supply boat, the Gannet, faded into a speck on the horizon, Elias felt the tension drain from him, leaving behind a cold residue of fear. He was a liar now, a conspirator. He climbed the winding stairs, his boots heavy on the stone, and found Layla standing at the circular window, watching the waves with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing their pattern. He suspected something, Layla stated as Elias entered the room, her voice devoid of emotion. The fisherman. He noticed the different shade of glass. Elias nodded grimly, stripping off his heavy coat. Thomas Cribbs has known this light for 50 years. He knows its rhythm, its shadows. I was sloppy. I let the oil lamp burn a few hours longer the night you arrived to keep you warm. It doesn't matter now, she replied, turning to face him. The immediate danger has passed, but the clock is still ticking. The consortium will be watching the coast, waiting for news of the satchel. We must act. She laid the 3 green ledger books out on the table. They looked innocuous, like account books for a small failing business. Inside these pages are not just names and figures, Layla explained, her amber eyes focused entirely on the task. My father was meticulous. He had to ensure that if the books fell into the wrong hands, they would be meaningless. They are written in a cipher. Elias, a man of simple, mechanical truth, was intrigued. A cipher? What kind? It is based on the Visionaire cipher, but with a complexity derived from my father's profession. The key is not a simple word. It's tied to an obscure text, the 1840 edition of the Nautical Almanac, specifically the section detailing the lunar distances and declination of Polaris for the first 6 months of the year. Elias stared at the green books, then at the woman. An astronomical almanac? A code key that shifts daily? That's brilliant, unbreakable by simple inspection. That's exactly, Layla confirmed, a slight professional pride showing on her face. But the problem is not decoding the books, Mr. Thorne. It is delivering them. I need to get a message to my contact in London, a single coded signal that confirms I'm alive and where I intend to meet him. How? We are 3 miles of open water from any telegraph office. I cannot simply sail a boat into shore with you aboard, and I certainly can't send a letter detailing a secret meeting. Layla walked over to the wall, where Elias had a large, detailed Admiralty chart of the Cornish coast pinned. She pointed a delicate finger to a spot on the mainland, a tiny, deep inlet tucked away from the main harbor town of Porthleven. I know this coast. My father prepared a contingency. This inlet, Godrivy Cove, it's only accessible by sea at high tide, and it's surrounded by high cliffs. There is an old abandoned fishing hut there, known only to a few. My contact, a Mr. Julian Vance, an academic at Oxford with a fierce anti-imperialist streak, knows this spot. We were supposed to meet there. It's risky. The tides are brutal, Elias cautioned, his mind already calculating the risk. It is unavoidable. But first, the message. She paused. Then her eyes lit up with a sudden, startling realization. She looked from the ledger books to the one thing in the room that held the most power, the great lens and the light. The light, she breathed. It is the only connection to the mainland that is constantly watched, constantly expected. It is also a way to transmit information in plain sight. Elias immediately understood. the semaphore, the naval flash codes. But only naval ships look for those, and they're not encoded in the nautical almanac. No, she said, her voice electric with possibility. Something simpler. Something I know my contact is watching for. We don't need a naval code. We need a signal variation. She took a piece of charcoal and sketched a sequence on a spare piece of paper. The long stone light flashes in a group flashing pattern. 3 quick flashes, a dark interval, then 2 quick flashes. A total of 5 flashes. That is its identity. We cannot change the rhythm, or it will draw immediate alarm. She pointed to the sketch. But the duration of the dark interval, the space between the flashes, that can be slightly varied. If we make the dark interval between the first set of 3 and the final set of 2 slightly longer, say by a second and a half, just for a single sequence, it will look like a slight mechanical hiccup to most. But to Julian Vance, it will be the message. A deliberate mechanical hiccup, Elias murmured, his mind already racing with the technical challenge. The mechanism was precise. A full second and a half was an eternity in lighthouse clockwork.
"If I do this, Thorne," she warned, "we are bound together. There is no turning back. The consortium may have eyes on that coastline, on that light. They might realize the hiccup wasn't a mechanical failure." "They won't," Elias stated, his hand steady on the brass. "Not tonight. Tonight the wind is high, and the air is thick with drizzle. They will blame the atmosphere or a slight slip of the mechanism. I am the keeper of the long stone light, and my light will tell your truth." His isolation was gone. His simple life had been replaced by this complex, dangerous web of international intrigue, all because he had chosen to save a woman and her satchel. "When?" Elias asked. "Tonight," Layla said, "mid-watch, when the rest of the world is asleep." The long stone light had its own rhythm, a heartbeat measured in the steady rotation of the great clockwork. Elias cherished this rhythm. It was the only constant in his sea-bound world, a promise of safety to passing ships. Tonight, he was going to betray it. The clock struck midnight, mid-watch. The wind had dropped to a sullen howl, and the air was thick with a clinging, cold mist, perfect conditions for a subtle transmission. Most observers on the coast would assume any minor deviation was caused by the weather's refraction. Elias and Layla were in the lantern room, the towering chamber of polished brass and flawless crystal that housed the lens. The lamp's flame was a powerful, mesmerizing eye, its beam concentrated and sent out to sea by the massive Fresnel lens, which spun on a bed of mercury. "The mechanism is designed for flawless consistency, Layla," Elias whispered, the light casting dancing shadows on his grave face. "To interrupt the governor's swing will require timing to the 10th of a second. If I misjudge, the whole timing sequence will skip, and the light will flash wildly. That will draw attention." Layla stood by the small hatch leading to the outer gallery, her face illuminated by the sweeping beam. She held the chronometer Elias used for celestial navigation, an instrument of ultimate precision. "We have practiced this," she said, her voice steady. "The rhythm is 3 short flashes, followed by the dark interval, then 2 short flashes. We need to prolong the dark interval by 1.5 seconds, no more, no less." Elias was already at the clockwork. The mechanism resembled a highly complex grandfather clock, powered by immense lead weights descending through the tower's center. He placed a small, thin sliver of polished whalebone, part of an old knitting needle, into a calculated position near the escape wheel. This bone was his tool of sabotage. "I will intercept the pendulum's swing at the exact moment the light is dark, after the 3rd flash.
Then I will have to release it precisely when the 1.5 seconds are up. You must call the time." Layla nodded, her eyes glued to the chronometer's second hand. Preparing to enter the sequence. First flash, second, third. The light swept past the coast and plunged the room into darkness. "Now!" Layla hissed. Elias acted. His hand shot out, placing the whalebone against the mechanism. He felt the grinding shudder of the intricate clockwork as its perfect motion was arrested. The darkness stretched out, held captive by his deliberate act. It felt like an eternity. 1/2, 1 second, Layla counted, her voice a low, intense chant. Elias's muscles were coiled, his focus absolute. He could hear the wind moaning outside, but inside, the only sound was the furious, imprisoned tick of the clockwork, struggling against the bone. 1.5, release! Elias snatched the whalebone away. The mechanism released with a metallic shing, and the rotation instantly resumed its relentless true pace. The light swept around, delivering the final 2 perfect flashes. The full 5-flash sequence was complete. The 3 flashes, the stretched dark interval, the final 2 flashes. The long stone light had just delivered its coded lie. Elias leaned back against the brass railing, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt physically sick. He had broken the one sacred rule of the tower. The light must never be tampered with. Layla didn't pause for emotion. She was all business. The total duration of the dark interval was 3.7 seconds, she reported, looking at her chronometer. A perfect 1.5-second elongation. If Julian Vance is watching, he received the message. "If," Elias repeated, his voice raspy. "And now we wait. We wait to see if the consortium's watchers are as meticulous as your Mr. Vance." He quickly removed the whalebone and examined the mechanism for any damage. A slight scuff on the brass, easily polished away. He had committed the perfect technical crime. 3 days passed. The tension in the tower was a palpable force, thick and heavy. Elias maintained the routine, cleaning the lens, charting the weather, logging the ships, all while waiting for a sign that Layla's coded message had been received. He made no mention of the light's deliberate hiccup in his logbook. He wrote only, "Mid-watch, heavy mist, slight refraction noted." Then, on Friday afternoon, Elias noticed a change on the shore. He was looking through his long glass, a powerful telescope kept in the lantern room for observing distant vessels, when he spotted a movement near Porthelvin. Not in the bustling harbor, but near the cliffs where the road from the inland gentry's estates met the coast. It was a black, closed brouette, a sleek 4-wheeled carriage pulled by 2 high-stepping, coal-black horses. It was an extravagant, expensive vehicle, clearly not belonging to a local merchant or farmer. It was the kind of conveyance used by high-level businessmen or foreign dignitaries. "Look," Elias said, handing the glass to Layla, "near the old cliff path. That carriage. It's been there for an hour, pulled off the main track." Layla brought the glass to her eye, her breathing quickening. She was silent for a long moment, tracing the carriage's outline. "They are early," she finally stated, her voice tight. "Julian Vance would take the coastal road, but he wouldn't use such a conspicuous vehicle. That is not my contact." She lowered the telescope, her face pale. "They are watching. The consortium has planted observers. They must have noticed the signal variation. They are covering the coast." "But they wouldn't know what the signal means," argued Elias, trying to keep the fear out of his voice. "They'd only know something was off." "No, but they know the Amaryllis sank near here. They know the satchel is missing.
And if the light, the only stable point of reference, had a momentary failure, they will assume someone, a survivor, is trying to use it. They are clever, Elias. They are not waiting for a coded reply. They are simply securing the perimeter.
The immediate threat was no longer the sea or the weather. It was the calculated patience of powerful men waiting in a black carriage on a distant shore. Elias's light, his only defense and connection to the world, had now become a beacon of suspicion. "We have to move," Layla declared, folding the chart of Godrevy Cove. "If they have eyes on the coast, we cannot risk waiting for Julian to arrive at the cove. They will intercept him. We must change the plan." Elias looked at the open expanse of sea, then back at the distant, silent carriage. His simple act of kindness had escalated into a high-stakes espionage game. The isolation of the lighthouse, once his shield, was now a cage. "What do we do?" he asked. Layla looked from the window back to the ledger books, her mind racing. "We have to leave the light. We have to go to the mainland, and we have to do it tonight." The decision to leave the Longstone light was a terrifying one, a direct contradiction of Elias's entire existence. A keeper abandoning his post was a disgrace. A keeper abandoning it in the dead of night for a mysterious passenger was a scandal that could land him in prison. Yet looking at the distant, silent black carriage on the cliff, Elias knew the greater danger lay in staying. "The dinghy is small, barely seaworthy in a swell, and we can only launch during the ebb tide, when the water is pulling away from the rocks. It's the only time we can get through the reef without striking bottom." "And when is that?" Layla asked, her hands already securing the 3 ledger books inside the satchel, which she then lashed tightly around her waist. "In 2 hours, just before 3 in the morning. It will be the darkest hour," Elias replied, checking the oars. "The tide will be running fast. We'll have the current helping us toward the mainland, but it's a brutal passage." Layla didn't flinch. "Good. The faster, the better, and the darker, the less they can see us." Elias realized that for all her fine clothes and scholarly pursuit, Layla possessed a deep reservoir of courage and practicality. She was focused entirely on the execution of the task. They descended the tower's stairs, the silence of the night pressing in on them. Before he reached the bottom, he stopped and went to his logbook. With his pen scratching against the heavy paper, he wrote one final cryptic entry. 15th November, 1867, 0100 hours. Heavy mist, visibility poor. Preparing for necessary repairs to mechanism housing, requiring temporary cessation of watch. Longstone Light will resume full operation at dawn. It was another lie, a cover for their absence, hinting at mechanical trouble that only a keeper could resolve. He closed the book, sealed the lower door of the lighthouse, and placed the keys in his pocket. He was committing to this path. The slipway was wet and slick with phosphorescent algae. The small rowing dinghy, the Mackerel, looked hopelessly fragile against the restless sea. Elias secured the satchel of supplies, including a bottle of fresh water, some hard biscuits, and his old naval compass. "Hold the bow line steady, and for God's sake, don't make a noise," Elias commanded in a low growl. The sound of waves crashing on the outer reef was loud enough to mask small noises, but the human voice carried unnervingly well over water. Layla braced herself, her small frame surprisingly strong, holding the boat stable against the surging water. Elias pushed the boat into the dark, swirling current. He jumped in, his weight settling the boat, and reached for the oars. The first 10 minutes were a grueling dance with the elements.
The ebb tide was sucking the water out, but they had to navigate the labyrinthine serpent's fangs, the very rocks that had devoured the Amaryllis. Elias pulled on the oars with powerful, desperate strokes, his muscles screaming against the strain. He knew every shadow, every eddy, every hidden tooth of rock. He was rowing not just with his arms, but with 50 years of accrued knowledge. Layla was invaluable. She sat low in the bow, her amber eyes straining through the gloom, whispering warnings. "Hard to port, Elias, a breaker off the starboard bow." We scraped past one final barnacled spine of rock, and then we were through. We had reached open water. Elias let the current take them, resting for a moment, his chest heaving. The long stone light, his granite tower, was a solid, unwavering pillar behind them, casting its broad, rhythmic beam over the ocean, oblivious to its keeper's flight. "Where are we heading?" Layla whispered, pointing to the compass. "We cannot land near Porthleven. Too many eyes," Elias panted, taking up the oars again. "We aim for Hella Point. It's 6 miles of hard rowing, but it's rugged, unpopulated country. We can ditch the boat there and walk the rest of the way to Godrevy Cove." The rhythm of the oars became a hypnotizing, agonizing grind against the vast indifference of the sea. Elias rowed with the memory of the black carriage fueling his effort. They were running from something far more dangerous than a natural storm. They made landfall just as the faintest smudge of bruised purple appeared on the eastern horizon. Hella Point was a desolate place, a jumble of massive wave-worn stones and sand. Elias pulled the mackerel high onto the beach, beyond the reach of the highest tide mark. He secured the rope to a sturdy outcrop of rock, effectively abandoning the boat until they could safely return. As they stepped onto the cold, damp sand, Elias felt an overwhelming sensation. He was an alien. He hadn't stood on the mainland in over a year. The air felt heavy, dense with the scent of damp earth and gorse, completely different from the clean, mineral air of the rock tower. "The cove is an hour's walk from here through the cliff tops," Elias stated, checking his bearings. "It's rough terrain. We must move quickly, before the first fishermen or farmers are about." Layla, surprisingly resilient, was already scrambling up the loose shale. They moved single file along a treacherous, narrow track that wound along the cliff edge. As the light increased, painting the jagged coastline in shades of gray and pale gold, the danger became more acute. They were visible now.
They had covered nearly half the distance when Leela suddenly stopped, flattening herself against the cold, damp earth. "Get down," she hissed, pulling Elias down beside her. "What is it?" Elias whispered, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Footprints," she muttered, pointing to the muddy track just ahead of them. "Fresh ones, not boots meant for farming or fishing. They are long, thin, city boots. 2 men walking together, perhaps an hour ago." Elias studied the prints. She was right. The prints were too narrow and the stride too measured for a local. "They are going the same way we are," Elias whispered, his heart sinking. "They are heading toward Godrevy Cove." The black carriage had not merely been watching the coast. The men inside had already anticipated their move. The coded signal had worked, but it had also alerted the enemy. The Corsarium was moving with terrifying speed and efficiency. "They know we'll head for the cove," Layla whispered, her face grim. "They are waiting for us. Or, worse, they are waiting for Julian." Elias took a deep, shaky breath. He had broken rules, risked his life, and rode 6 miles through the dark to deliver a woman and her satchel to safety, only to find the trap already sprung. "We can't go to Godrevy Cove," Elias determined. "It's a funnel. We'll be cornered." He looked inland toward the undulating hills and the dense, dark patches of woodland. "We go high. We head away from the coast and into the thickets. We need to disappear into the countryside." Layla gave a sharp nod.
Lead the way, keeper. I trust your knowledge of the land more than the sea now." Elias turned inland, abandoning the coast road and scrambling up a steep, overgrown embankment. He led them away from the cove, away from the trap, and deep into the unknown forested heart of Cornwall, a fugitive with an even more dangerous destiny ahead. The granite of the cliff paths gave way to the dense, tangled undergrowth of ancient Cornish woodland. Elias, accustomed only to the slick surfaces of rock and brass, moved with a surprising instinctive agility. He was born inland, the son of a copper miner, and the wild terrain was written into his muscle memory. "Keep low," he hissed, pushing aside a curtain of thorny brambles. "And step only on the stones or the thick moss. We need to leave no trace." Leela followed without complaint, her fine indigo wool now snagged and torn. The weight of the satchel was pulling on her shoulder, but she never loosened her grip. They traveled for 2 exhausting hours, moving roughly parallel to the coast, but deep enough into the woods to be invisible from the track. The forest, still dripping with morning dew, was silent, save for the sharp snap of twigs underfoot and the frantic beating of their own hearts. Elias finally brought them to a halt in a small, sheltered clearing, dominated by a sprawling, moss-covered druid oak, a tree ancient enough to have witnessed 1,000 storms. "We rest here for 10 minutes, Elias whispered, sinking onto the damp ground. "We've put a mile of thick forest between us and the coast watchers. They won't venture off the path without dogs." Leela finally allowed herself to take a drink from the canteen. "Thank you, Elias. You navigate land as skillfully as the sea." "It's just observation," he replied, shaking his head. "Knowing where the hard ground is, where the water flows, the sea and the land, they both demand respect for their currents." As he spoke, his gaze swept the clearing. He noticed something that chilled him, a faint trail of wood smoke, almost invisible, wafting up from a depression in the ground nearby. Elias held up a warning hand to Leela and silently drew the heavy, old-fashioned pocket pistol he carried, a relic from his time in the Royal Navy. He crept toward the smoke's source, heart pounding, expecting to find the men from the black carriage. Instead, he found a small, impeccably neat camp nestled in a hollow, a canvas tent barely larger than a pup, a small fire pit, and a simple folding stool. Sitting on the stool, sipping tea from a tin mug and sketching in a notebook, was a woman. She was older than Elias, perhaps in her late 60s, with a face mapped by sun and wind and startlingly alert gray eyes. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she wore practical, earth-toned clothing. This was no fugitive or spy. This was a naturalist. Elias kept the pistol leveled, but low. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice a tight rasp. The woman did not jump. She calmly set her mug down and looked up at him. "Good morning to you, sir. A lighthouse peeper, judging by the set of your shoulders and the scent of whale oil. I am Agnes Merritt, and this is my camp. I am charting the native orchid populations of the Lizard Peninsula." Pointing a garneled, paint-stained finger toward your waist, and you have a friend hiding behind the oak, carrying a very expensive foreign bag. Are you lost, or is this a dramatic game of hide-and-seek? Elias hesitated. Her composure was absolute. This was not the sharp, aggressive suspicion of the official Finch, nor the calculated threat of the men on the coast. It was the calm, clear-eyed observation of a scientist. Leela stepped out from behind the tree, her gaze meeting Agnes's. "We are running from men who want to silence us, Miss Merritt. They are looking for these." She gestured to the satchel. "We need shelter, a way to disappear for a day or two." Agnes's gray eyes flickered once to the satchel, then settled back on Leela's exhausted face. She took another slow sip of her tea. "Silencing, you say? The wealthy gentlemen of this country are fond of silencing anything that challenges their entitlements. I prefer orchids myself. They are less complicated than humans, but far more resilient. Now tell me, Keeper, what kind of men are after you? Local bullies or men with official ties? Men of international commerce, Elias admitted. They control shipping lines, banks, and the consciences of many powerful men in London. Ah, the invisible hand of empire. Now that is a threat worth respecting. Very well. My little camp is merely a camp, but I keep a small, isolated cottage deeper in the woods. It is an old hunter's lodge, difficult to find and impossible to see from the path. You may take shelter there. She stood up, tall and unhurried. I am leaving this morning for the village of St. Kervin to replenish my supplies and mail my specimens. I can tell the Locan people I saw nothing unusual on the track. You will be safe there until nightfall. Why? Elias asked, lowering the pistol entirely. Why help us? Agnes smiled, a genuine warm expression that smoothed the lines on her face for a moment. Because, Mr. Torn, I have spent a lifetime watching the fragile beauty of this country being choked by the vines of greed, and I have always preferred resilience over decay. Your friend, and whatever she carries, sounds like resilience. She handed Elias a key on a leather thong. Follow the narrow deer path until you reach the standing stone. The cottage is 50 yards beyond, tucked into the gully. There are rations and a stove. Stay hidden. With that, Agnes Merritt packed her notebook and her mug, placed a new log on her dying fire, and, without a single backward glance, walked off into the thicket, leaving the lighthouse keeper and the mysterious scholar with a key to a temporary sanctuary.